Hey folks, in this video I would like to lay out my approach and suggestions for learning a new opening. This is a topic that I think is really important to most players, and it's also something where I think a lot of players often get it wrong or at least are confused by the process. So I want to give you guys some kind of blueprint or framework for learning any opening you'd like and discuss a little bit about what it takes to truly master an opening. So I'm going to be breaking down this video into 3 parts and offer different suggestions for different rating levels. So we're going to talk about players between 0 to 1200 and how they should approach the opening, players 1200 to 1800 and how they should approach the opening, and of course we'll talk about what players 1800 and up should do as well to really try and master their openings. So now let's move on to players 1800 and up. So this is more or less the minimum rating where I think it's actually helpful to start keeping some opening files and maybe even doing your own analysis and reviewing your openings. Now, pretty much most of what I said for the previous group I think is going to apply here. I still think it's more important to understand key middle game ideas before trying to learn the specifics of opening theory, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that if you've gotten to this level and you've been playing your opening for a few years or so, that you're already more or less familiar with a lot of the major themes, and now you're trying to work out and really start building a professional repertoire. So once you're ready to start developing some opening files, there are many tools out there that you can use. Like I mentioned, I personally use ChessBase because this is a program that I've been using for many years. It's the program that pretty much all of the world's top and professional players have been using for many years, and it's kind of considered the gold standard when it comes to creating your opening files and doing your opening analysis. But it's by no means necessary for the majority of players out there, and you can create your own opening files using Lead Chess Studies, using Chessable, using some of the free database programs. There are many programs out there. There is a bit of a learning curve. You have to learn how to kind of navigate the program and learn how to input games and save stuff. But once you get the hang of it, it is a very, very helpful process when it comes to building your own opening files and really tracking your own repertoire. So my main recommendation for starting to build your repertoire is to just keep it simple and just focus on what you actually play. For your white repertoire, for example, let's say you're an e4 player, you should pretty much have one main response against all of black's main openings. So one main thing you're doing against e4, e5, whether it's the Ruy Lopez or the Italian game or the Scotch. If you're curious on what openings I actually think you should play, we did a number of videos on this channel with our special guest Grandmaster Perelstein, where we offered our suggestions for both white and black e4 players, d4 players, what to do against e4, what to do against d4, what openings we think are good and worth studying. If you're curious in those videos as well, I'll link to them in the description below. But for now, the point is you should have one main option that you're playing consistently. Now, there are players out there who like to switch it up and play lots and lots of different openings. I think this is a perfectly valid approach and kind of comes with some obvious pros and cons. The pros are you're kind of a moving target. You're not going to be very predictable in the opening, and you'll be able to feel like you can play a lot of different positions without worrying too much about the theory. The con of this approach is that typically players who kind of play everything don't really learn any one or two systems deeply. They don't feel like they have solid ground to stand on. So for me, and I think for a lot of players, I've always found it more comfortable to kind of have some main openings, my main repertoire that I'm really comfortable with, and then from time to time, maybe switching it up. If I want to learn a new variation or add some new weapon to my repertoire, I can do that, but still having some kind of fundamental repertoire to work with. So I would suggest one main opening against e4, e5, one main thing you're doing against the Sicilian. Of course, within the Sicilian, there are many different variations. So you can play the c3 Sicilian here, for example. You can play the closed Sicilian or the Grand Prix attack. Personally, I recommend the open Sicilian, starting with knight f3 and playing for d4. And in the open Sicilian, as experienced e4 players of course know, black has a bunch of different options here. They can play for the Najdorf, they can play the dragon, the classical Sicilian. Of course, d6 earlier was not even forced. There are a lot of e6 Sicilians and knight c6 Sicilians. And as you develop your repertoire, I would encourage you to choose one main line against each of these and slowly build out your repertoire from there. So how do you actually build and maintain a repertoire? My quick recommendation here is to just have a different game or file for each new variation. So what that means is don't just put all of your analysis in every opening in just one long document. You'll never be able to memorize everything. Instead, split it up. So you should have an analysis file for the Dragon Sicilian, for example, and then another one for the Caro Con. And you can split up the Caro into different variations if you really need to, if it gets too bulky. Personally, I just prefer splitting things up and keeping it simple. I don't recommend including just a bunch of computer analysis and just dumping a bunch of analysis in your notes. Kind of like a been there, done that situation for me. I know from experience, you're never going to remember thousands and thousands of moves in the opening. So what I recommend is just keeping it simple and sticking to what you actually know and play. And that means building your repertoire from memory. So maybe you play the English attack against the knight orf. So let's say we have knight f6 here, knight c3, a6, and you decide you want to play bishop e3, or you want to play bishop to g5. I don't recommend just putting in a bunch of moves, just looking up the theory and just trying to input as many games as possible. You'll never remember anything. Instead, start small, start with this position, input some of Black's options that you're familiar with, whether it's e6 or queen b6 or what have you, and then just take it very slow and input just a couple moves at a time. Something that you can actually feel like is manageable and you can remember. If your repertoire is too long and complicated, you're usually going to forget stuff and you're never going to feel like you really know what you're doing. So keep your repertoire simple and just build it out very slowly. What a lot of players do is they start with just the bare bones, the first 6 moves of the variation, and then as they play games online, whether it's training games or real tournament games, they'll input some variations that they see, at least 1 or 2 moves from their opponent, and then kind of look up what to do against that and maybe do a little bit of analysis. But again, I don't recommend going super deep. Your opponents are never going to go that deep with you, or if anything, it's going to be really rare. Just look at the opening a few moves at a time. It's really hard to remember this long line if you don't have a really solid understanding, let's say the first 5 to 10 moves. And there's going to be lots of different variations that your opponents can throw at you. So in my opinion, when it comes to the opening, it's kind of better to study wide, looking at a lot of different stuff, rather than studying deep, looking at one variation super deep, 20-25 moves, and following some of those like GM prep books. Those books are written for pretty much professional players who want like really in-depth analysis, and they're good reference books where if you really need to look up some opening and you really want to get the details and see all the latest high-level theory, it's there available for you. But is that actually going to help you in the majority of your games? In my experience, probably not. So ultimately the process is play some games, check your games against the official theory, or if you're working with some video course or Chessable course, see if you play the opening correctly, and then after that input a couple moves into your own personal repertoire that you feel like you really understand. So you know, okay, next time my opponent goes for this variation, I'm going to play this move, and then my plan is to castle queenside, or I'm going to play this move, and then my plan is so on. You don't really have to know it super deep, just a matter of knowing 1 or 2 moves extra and then understanding your plan from there. That's always going to be critical, understanding your plan from there. If you have any opening position where you don't really know what you're playing for, the computer eval is not going to matter. I could give you a position that's +1, but if you don't know what you're doing with that opening from there, if you don't really know what your plan is, what your plan of attack is, how you're going to be improving your pieces or what your targets are, you're still going to have a tough time even though you got a good position out of the opening. So take it slow, guys, really baby steps. The reason it seems like some players have just mastered their openings is because they've been playing these openings for years and years, and in some cases decades. There are grandmasters out there that have been playing the same systems for 10, 15, 20 years. So of course they've developed this really deep long-term understanding of the opening, and they know a bunch of theory. It's because they've just been playing it for so long. So there's no magic recipe where you can just learn all the openings in a couple of months and just be like an opening beast. It really takes years and years of practice and hard work before you feel like you have a very solid understanding of the openings that you play. Lastly, what I want to mention for the more advanced players out there, especially once you're getting into that like 2000 ELO zone, 2100, 2200, you want to make sure your repertoire doesn't have any holes that your opponents can exploit. A really common one is what you do after knight f3 followed by c4. So for example, if you play the Nimzo Indian as black against d4, so c4, e6, knight c3, bishop to b4, and let's say you play against knight f3 here, the Bogo Indian, this is of course a perfectly solid opening to choose, but if your opponent starts with knight f3, knight f6, c4, you go e6, and they play something like g3, you're not really able to play either the Nimzo or the Bogo here. Here the move bishop b4 would just be a complete waste of time, and either your opponent just leaves your bishop on b4 doing nothing, or they'll kick you with a3 and you'll just have to go back losing time. So it's really important that you're aware of some of these repertoire switches. For example, let's say you played the move b6 here, now white plays d4, and all of a sudden you're playing a Queen's Indian, not exactly the opening you signed up for. It's really important to avoid this kind of thing, and in general, players do kind of struggle with the repertoire when white starts off with knight f3 or c4. Grunfeld players in particular also have to be careful here. It's after g6, knight c3. If you don't play d5 in this position and you play bishop g7, for example, then white can play e4, and all of a sudden you're playing a King's Indian. This is a very typical way that someone can kind of trick you into something that you don't play. And it's really important that your repertoire is kind of up to date and you're not getting move ordered into something that you don't play. Of course, there's lots of very, very good options against knight f3 and c4. The point is just to learn one so that you don't feel like all of a sudden you're playing some opening that you've never seen before. This is an issue that I personally had trouble with, and I see a lot of players at the 2000, 2200 level that know their main openings against e4 and d4 really, really well, but then against some of these weird move orders with knight f3, c4, especially when white eventually plays a future d4, this can be kind of tricky to handle. So this is one thing that I do encourage you guys to watch out for. And as always, if you ever get caught in the opening with something you really just didn't know and you just totally get crushed, I do think it's useful to then go and look up what you should have done against it or how you can avoid that for the future. So it's important to have your bases covered and make sure your opponent doesn't transpose you into something that you don't play. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this video. I hope that was some helpful advice for you guys. I know I really threw a lot in there. If you have any further questions, anything I didn't mention, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, we'd appreciate a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please make sure to do so. With that, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.